There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when 200 people realize all at once that they were about to witness something they were never supposed to see. I had heard that silence before, at funerals, at verdicts. I never expected to hear it on the day I was ordained. My name is Daniel Okafor. 6 weeks ago, I stood at the front of Living Word Cathedral in a black robe with a deacon's stole draped over my shoulders, waiting for Bishop Thomas Ellison to lay his hands on my head and make official something I had worked toward quietly for 4 years. My wife, Naomi, sat in the second pew in a cream-colored dress she had picked out weeks earlier, smiling the kind of smile people practice in mirrors. I want to tell you something about myself before I go further, because it matters for what happened next. I am an accountant by profession and, I suppose, by temperament. I notice discrepancies, numbers that almost balance but don't quite. People are the same way to me. Most of them believe they're better liars than they are because most people they lie to aren't looking for the gap between what adds up and what doesn't. I had been looking for 3 months by the time I stood at that altar. It started small. A dinner Naomi said was with her sister that her sister, when I mentioned it in passing, had no memory of. A new perfume. A phone that had started living face down on the counter instead of upright like it always had. I didn't confront her. I have never been a man who confronts before he's certain, because uncertainty handed to an intelligent liar just gives her time to build a better story. So I watched, and I waited, and eventually I hired someone whose job is patience. A private investigator named Wallace Greer, recommended to me by a colleague who'd needed similar services during his own divorce 2 years earlier. It took Wallace 11 days to bring me a manila folder with photographs of my wife having dinner, twice, with a man named Preston Cade, my own second cousin, a man who had been at our wedding, who had toasted our marriage with a glass of champagne in his hand and a grin on his face. I now understood differently. I sat with that folder for 4 days before I did anything, not because I was paralyzed, because I was deciding what kind of man I wanted to be on the other side of this. I could have shown up at our front door with the photographs and screamed the house down. Some men would have. I am not built that way, and more importantly, I did not want Naomi's betrayal to be the headline of my own ordination. I had worked too long, prayed too much, given too many quiet Tuesday nights to Bible study and hospital visits and administrative meetings nobody wanted to sit through, to let her affair become the story of the biggest day of my spiritual life. So instead, 12 days before the ordination, I asked for a private meeting with Bishop Ellison. He is not a man who is easily surprised. 61 years old, 34 of them spent leading that congregation. He has counseled through affairs, embezzlement, addiction, every private catastrophe a family can produce. But when I laid that folder open on his desk, I watched something move behind his eyes that I don't think I'd seen in 4 years of knowing him. I'm not telling you this to stop the ordination, I said. I've prayed on this more than anything else in my life, and I still believe I'm meant to serve. I'm telling you because I think Naomi may try to do something at the ceremony, and I don't want you blindsided if she does. He asked me how I could possibly know that. I told him the truth, because 2 nights earlier, I'd overheard her on the phone with her sister, the same sister who'd never had that dinner with her, saying, quote, "If he tries to go through with this, I'm not going to just sit there and let him stand up like some saint." I hadn't understood the threat fully at the time. I understood it completely by the time I finished laying out the folder for Bishop Ellison. He kept the folder. He told me he would pray on how to handle it, and he asked me one question before I left his office that I have thought about every day since. Are you sure you still want to go through with the ordination, knowing what's waiting for you at home afterward? I'm not marrying the church, Bishop, I told him. I'm answering a calling. Whatever happens with my marriage happens separately from that. He nodded slowly, the way he does when he's already decided something and isn't ready to say it out loud yet. The morning of the ordination, Naomi helped me straighten my collar in the mirror before we left the house. She kissed my cheek and told me she was proud of me. I let her. I want to be honest. Some part of me, even knowing everything I knew, still wanted that moment to be real. That's the strange mathematics of a long marriage. You can hold absolute proof of betrayal in a folder in a locked drawer, and still, for one unguarded second in a bathroom mirror, want the lie to be true. Living Word Cathedral was full that morning. Standing room in the back, the choir robed and ready, my parents in from out of state, my business partner and half my accounting clients scattered through the pews because, as my father likes to say, half this town does business with somebody who worships somewhere near this altar. Bishop Ellison stood at the pulpit in his full vestments, and I stood below him in my robe, and for the first 20 minutes, everything proceeded exactly the way 4 years of preparation said it would. He read the liturgy of ordination. He spoke about the weight and honor of the diaconate, about service, about the particular loneliness of leadership, and the particular joy of being trusted with people's private grief. I knelt when I was supposed to kneel. I answered when I was supposed to answer. And then, just as Bishop Ellison lifted his hands to begin the laying on of hands, the exact center of the ceremony, the moment 200 phones in that room were lifted to record, Naomi stood up from the second pew. "I can't let this happen," she said, her voice carrying easily in a sanctuary built for acoustics, not without everyone knowing who they're really ordaining. I did not turn around immediately. I want you to understand that. I had spent 3 months learning to sit inside moments like this without letting my face give anything away. And that discipline held, even as my own heart moved somewhere up into my throat. "Naomi," Bishop Ellison said, his hands still raised, his voice even. "This is a sacred moment. Please." "He's been unfaithful," she said. And I heard the specific rehearsed clarity in her voice, the sentence of someone who has said these words to herself in a mirror many times before saying them to a room. "For months. I have text messages. I have hotel confirmations. I found out 3 weeks ago, and I have been sitting in this church trying to decide whether God would want me to stay silent while you all treat him like some kind of saint." She was crying now. Real tears, the kind that come easily to people who have convinced themselves of their own story so thoroughly that their body responds as if it were true. I have proof. I brought it. I didn't want to do this, but I couldn't let him stand up there in front of God and lie. I finally turned around. She was holding her phone in one hand, screen out toward the congregation, though no one was close enough to actually read anything on it. The gesture itself was the evidence, the performance of certainty rather than the substance of it. Beside her, in the aisle, stood Preston Cade, my cousin, dressed like he'd come prepared for exactly this, his hand resting lightly on the back of the pew as if he belonged there, as if he had been invited into this moment as a witness rather than the other half of the accusation nobody in that room yet understood. "I have hotel confirmations," Naomi said again, louder now, playing to the room. "Under his name. Multiple dates. I can show anyone who wants to see them." The congregation had gone fully, completely silent. I could hear the air conditioning system cycling on somewhere above the choir loft. I could hear my mother, 3 rows back, make a small, strangled sound I will never forget. I did not raise my voice. I did not move toward her. I stood exactly where I was in my robe in front of the altar, and I said the only thing I had decided days earlier that I would say if this moment ever actually came. "Bishop Ellison," I said, "I think you're holding something that might be relevant right now." The room did not understand what I meant. Naomi certainly didn't. I watched her face for the half second before Bishop Ellison moved, and I saw nothing there but confusion, which told me everything I needed to know about how confident she'd been that this moment belonged entirely to her. Bishop Ellison reached beneath the small table where the ceremonial elements sat: the oil, the book of order, the ordination certificate already signed and waiting, and he lifted out a plain manila folder that had, until that second, looked like nothing more than part of the ceremony's paperwork. "Naomi," he said, and for the first time, his voice had an edge in it. I had genuinely never heard from him in 4 years. "Daniel came to my office 12 days ago. He told me you might do something like this today. And he gave me something I think this congregation deserves to understand, given that you've decided to make accusations in front of all of them." "What are you talking about?" Naomi said, and the crack in her voice was not performance this time. "He came to me with proof of his own," Bishop Ellison said, "not to defend himself against something that hadn't happened yet, but because he believed you were planning exactly this. And he wanted the truth available in this room, rather than let a lie stand unanswered in front of 200 witnesses." He opened the folder. "Photographs, dated, time-stamped, of you and Preston Cade at the Wardell Inn on 3 separate occasions over the last 2 months. I watched the color leave Naomi's face in real time. Beside her, Preston Cade took an actual physical step backward, as though putting distance between himself and her would somehow unhappen the last 90 seconds. "Those aren't what they look like," Naomi said, but the sentence had no architecture to it anymore. It was just noise, the sound a lie makes in the half second after it's already been disproven and the person saying it hasn't caught up yet. "I have hotel confirmations too," I said quietly, still not raising my voice, still standing exactly where I'd been ordained to stand. "Under your maiden name, 3 dates in the last 2 months. I have phone records showing calls to Preston at hours you told me you were asleep. I found out everything you just tried to accuse me of, Naomi, except the part where it happened to me. It happened to you. Or rather, it happened because of you." The murmur that moved through that sanctuary was not the murmur of 200 people picking a side. It was the specific sound of 200 people simultaneously recalculating everything they thought they understood about the last 90 seconds, and most of the last several years. "I brought the proof to Bishop Ellison privately," I continued, "because I did not want my ordination to become a referendum on my marriage. I still don't." "But you made that choice for both of us the moment you stood up in front of this congregation and tried to make your affair into my scandal." I looked at her for a long moment. 6 years of marriage, a home, holidays, the specific quiet comfort of knowing someone's coffee order and which side of the bed they preferred. All of it sitting somewhere behind my sternum like a weight I hadn't fully set down yet. "I forgive you. I want you to know that because it's true, and because forgiveness is actually part of what I'm being ordained to practice today. Not just preach, but forgiveness and consequence are not the same thing, and you are about to learn the difference." Preston Cade had already started backing toward the side aisle, the particular walk of a man calculating exits, when Bishop Ellison spoke again, and this time, his voice carried the full authority of 34 years leading that congregation. "Preston," he said, "your family has been part of this church for 2 generations. I would ask you to stay, actually. because I think this congregation deserves to see this through rather than watch you slip out the side door the way you apparently prefer to handle things." Preston stopped walking. I'll give him that much. Whatever else he wasn't stupid enough to make a scene of his own exit in a room that had just watched Naomi's collapse in real time. Naomi was crying now in a completely different register than the practiced tears from 90 seconds earlier. The sound of someone whose script has been taken away from her mid-performance and who has nothing prepared for what comes after. "Daniel, please, can we not do this here, please?" "You decided where here was," I said. "I was ready to let this stay private. You weren't." Bishop Ellison closed the folder gently and set it back on the table. And then he did something I did not expect. Something that told me exactly why this man had led that congregation for 34 years. He turned to face the room fully, lifted his hands the way he had before Naomi interrupted him, and said in a voice that carried to the very back pew, "I believe we were in the middle of an ordination." The room did not know whether to laugh or gasp. And in the end, it did a strange, human mixture of both. A ripple of stunned, relieved sound moving from the front pews to the back. I understood in that moment what he was actually doing. He was not ignoring what had just happened. He was refusing to let two people's private catastrophe steal a sacred moment that belonged to something bigger than either of them. Or me. "Daniel," he said, turning back to me, "do you still wish to be ordained today, knowing everything this congregation has just witnessed?" "I do," I said. "Now more than ever, honestly. Because if there was ever a day I needed to be reminded what this calling actually means, it's today." He laid his hands on my head. I felt the weight of them, and the weight of 200 people. Watching in a silence that had transformed in the space of 5 minutes from horrified to reverent. He spoke the final words of the liturgy. The congregation said amen, and this time it did not sound like a formality. It sounded like something that had been earned in front of them, in real time, rather than simply performed. Naomi left before the closing hymn. Preston left with her, though not, from what I understand, in the same car. Wallace Greer, who I'd asked to attend quietly in the back pew that morning specifically because I suspected something might happen, told me afterward that they'd argued in the parking lot loudly enough that 2 ushers went out to make sure it didn't escalate further. That was 6 weeks ago. Naomi filed for divorce 11 days later. I suspect on her attorney's advice, since contesting anything after a public collapse of that magnitude in front of 200 witnesses, including several of my own accounting clients, and at least one actual judge who attends Living Word on Sundays, was never going to be a fight she could win quietly. We are still finalizing the details. I have not asked for anything beyond what's fair. I did not do any of this for the house or the savings account, or even really for vindication. I did it because I did not want to spend the rest of my life wondering whether I should have said something sooner, and because I refused to let someone else's dishonesty become the reason I abandoned something I had spent 4 years building toward. Preston Cade stopped coming to Living Word entirely. I heard secondhand that his own wife filed for divorce 9 days after the ordination, once the story had made its way through enough of the congregation to reach her before he found a way to explain it himself. I take no pleasure in that, particularly. I take no pleasure in any of it, actually, which surprised me because I expected to. I expected the moment Bishop Ellison opened that folder to feel like triumph. Mostly, it just felt like grief with an audience. Bishop Ellison has since asked me to take on the church's financial counseling ministry, helping couples navigate money conflicts before they metastasize into something worse, which he told me, with a small, knowing smile, felt like the appropriate assignment given recent events. I said yes. I think there is something almost unbearably fitting about spending the next season of my life helping people build the kind of honesty in their marriages that mine, in the end, did not survive. Not because I lacked it, but because it took two people to keep, and only one of us ever really tried. People ask me sometimes whether I regret bringing the folder to Bishop Ellison instead of confronting Naomi privately the moment I found out. I don't. Not because public exposure is always the right answer. Most of the time, I still believe it isn't. But I knew, the way you know certain things about a person after 6 years of marriage, that if I confronted her privately, she would find a way to make the story about my distrust rather than her betrayal. And she would still, somehow, find a way to arrive at that altar with an accusation of her own. I did not choose the fight. I only chose to make sure that when it came, the truth would already be standing in the room before the first lie finished being spoken. If you've ever quietly gathered proof while someone you loved was busy building a story to use against you, I hope this reminds you of something. Patience isn't the same as weakness, and the truth doesn't need you to raise your voice. It just needs somewhere safe to land when the moment finally comes. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Hidden Truth Films. There are more stories like this one still ahead. Quiet people, patient people who understood the truth long before the room around them caught up.